I slid my business card across the glass conference table like I was pushing the last chip in a game I'd been playing for 12 years. The CEO laughed. 20 minutes earlier, Miles Kettering had fired me in front of 6 executives from our buyer. Now he was staring at the card like it had just accused him of a crime. The laughter stopped first. Then the color drained from his face. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Odessa Lane. I'm 46. And until that morning, I'd spent over a decade building North Shore systems from a rented office above a nail salon into a logistics platform valued at just under $700 million. I didn't do it with flashy slogans or viral decks. I did it in spreadsheets no one read, contracts no one understood, and contingency plans everyone ignored until they needed them. I designed the vendor network that kept our costs stable when fuel prices spiked. I negotiated the compliance framework that let us scale without regulators breathing down our necks when a hurricane shut down half the coast. My backup routing kept shipments moving when a data center failed at 2 a.m. I was the one on the call, not posting leadership quotes online. Then our founder retired. No transition, no overlap, just a farewell email on a Friday and an empty office on Monday. That's when Miles arrived, 27 years old. The founder's godson, MBA from a school better known for tailgates than operations. On his first day, he called an all-hands meeting and announced, "We're going to rethink how this company works." People nodded. I didn't. Within a week, department heads were bypassing him and coming straight to me. Legal, finance, procurement. I fixed what broke. I cleaned up what he rushed. I stayed late. I documented everything. Because when you've been around long enough, you learn something important. Corporate disasters don't start with explosions. They start with confidence, unsupported by competence. And when Harborwell Group began its acquisition due diligence, I knew exactly how this would end. Miles just didn't know yet. Hey, how are you feeling right now? If you've been sitting for a while, maybe take a moment to stand up and gently change rooms or step into a different space. It can reset your head in a quiet way. Where are you listening from today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If this moment resonates with you, consider subscribing not for the algorithm, but so we can keep meeting like this, story by story, because what happened next was the moment everything quietly shifted. After that meeting, something subtle changed. I stopped being invited. Miles didn't announce it outright. He just stopped adding me to calendars. Strategy reviews became leadership only. Vendor calls moved to ad hoc chats I somehow never saw. When people asked where I was, he'd shrug and say, "Odessa's more execution than vision." I took that as permission, because when you've spent enough years inside a company, you learn the difference between being ignored and being underestimated. One is dangerous. The other is useful. I stayed quiet. I did my job. I fixed what I was still authorized to fix, and I documented everything else. Harborwell's due diligence team had questions, lots of them. On paper, North Shore looked strong. Revenue was stable. Margins were healthy. But the questions they asked weren't about numbers. They were about continuity. What happens if this vendor fails? Who owns the compliance keys? Where is the escalation authority documented? Miles answered with confidence. I answered with attachments. At first, the messages came indirectly. A junior analyst would accidentally CC me. A legal associate would ask for historical context. I responded once, cleanly, with facts. No opinions, no commentary, just evidence. Then Evelyn Hart, Harborwell's integration lead, wrote to me directly, "Odessa, could you spare 15 minutes to clarify a few operational dependencies?" I stared at that email longer than I should have, because I knew what it meant. You don't ask someone like that unless you already suspect they're holding the real map. I agreed. One call, 15 minutes. That was my rule. Evelyn didn't waste time. She asked about vendor lock-ins, undocumented overrides, and emergency authorities. I told her exactly where the risks were and where the safeguards lived. I mentioned, almost casually, that several of those safeguards were person-dependent. She paused. Person dependent on who, historically, I said. On me. That was all it took. After that, things accelerated quietly. I was copied on draft transition charts. My name appeared in footnotes, not headlines footnotes, the kind that survive revisions, the kind lawyers don't remove without reason. Meanwhile, Miles was busy announcing changes. He replaced our procurement workflow with a lean approval model suggested by a consultant who had never shipped a pallet in his life. Payments stalled. A supplier called threatening to halt deliveries. I solved it in one call, then logged the incident and sent the timeline to Harborwell's risk mailbox. No commentary, just facts. The strangest part wasn't Miles' arrogance. It was his certainty. He genuinely believed leadership was about speaking the loudest in the room. That execution would magically follow intention. That systems ran because people believed in them. But systems don't believe, they obey. And I was beginning to realize something unsettling and powerful. Harborwell wasn't watching Miles anymore. They were watching what happened when he wasn't in the room. The first document arrived late on a Wednesday night. No subject line, no greeting. Just a file labeled Transition Staffing Internal Draft. I almost ignored it. Almost. Years of habit made me open it anyway. It wasn't meant for me. That much was clear. It was a working document. Unfinished. Full of tracked changes and placeholders. Names missing. Roles half defined. The kind of file that exists before decisions become official. I scrolled slowly. There it was. A section titled Operational Continuity Authority. Under it, a single-line Continuity Lead TBD. I leaned back in my chair and let that sit, because when something is marked to be determined, it doesn't mean undecided. It means someone important is still thinking. And in acquisitions, thinking is power. I saved the file to a folder on my personal drive and named it Notes, not insurance, not leverage, just notes. I wasn't ready to admit what it might become. The next few days were quiet on the surface and chaotic underneath. Miles pushed through another optimization, this time reassigning approval rights for compliance reporting. He didn't tell legal, he didn't tell finance, he certainly didn't tell Harborwell. The system locked itself within hours. Contracts stalled. Reports failed validation. A regulator sent a polite but unmistakably serious inquiry. Miles blamed legacy rigidity in a company-wide message and promised a fix by end of week. Harborwell noticed. Evelyn called me again. This time, she didn't ask for 15 minutes. She asked for my assessment. I didn't editorialize. I didn't assign blame. I walked her through the dependencies Miles didn't know existed and the authority chains he'd unknowingly broken. I forwarded logs, screenshots, timestamps. At the end, she was quiet. Then she said, "You realize this isn't sustainable." "I do," I replied. "That's why I documented it after that call." The tone shifted. I wasn't asked what was happening anymore. I was asked what should happen next. Draft org charts arrived with my comments already incorporated. Risk memos referenced Lane's assessment. Legal asked whether certain changes required continuity approval. That phrase again. Continuity approval. Miles. Meanwhile, was celebrating a successful transformation sprint. He brought in a friend from business school to advise on strategic velocity. The friend suggested cutting a vendor redundancy I'd installed after a near miss 3 years earlier. I flagged the risk. Miles ignored it. 2 days later. That redundancy was the only thing preventing a shutdown. I didn't say I told you so. I just sent Harborwell the incident report. Late Friday afternoon. Another file landed in my inbox. Same label. Updated draft. This time, the placeholder was gone. Continuity lead Odessa Lane. No announcement, no congratulations. Just my name, typed cleanly, like it had always belonged there. I closed my laptop and sat in the empty office for a long moment. Because once your name appears in documents like that, there's no going back. You're no longer observing the shift. You are the shift. If you think you understand, The next paragraph will change your mind. I didn't tell anyone about the document. Not legal, not finance, not even the two directors who still quietly checked in with me when things broke. Authority like that doesn't need an announcement. In fact, it works better without one. Miles found out something was different, though he just couldn't name it. Meetings stopped starting on time. Decisions stalled halfway through execution. People began asking, "Has this been cleared?" instead of, "What does Miles want?" The air shifted not loudly, but unmistakably. The real test came the following Monday. Miles called an emergency leadership sync. I wasn't on the invite. That wasn't new. What was new was the follow-up email from Harborwell's legal counsel, sent 12 minutes after the meeting ended. Odessa, we understand a staffing change was proposed this morning. Can you confirm whether continuity approval has been granted? I read that line twice, because no one had used that phrase in front of Miles yet. I replied carefully. One sentence. No continuity approval has been issued. That was it. Within an hour, the proposed change was reversed. No explanation, no apology. Miles sent a brief message blaming misalignment in the approval chain. He never mentioned my name, but he started watching me after that. I could feel it when I walked past his office, when he lingered after meetings, when he asked questions that weren't really questions, more like probes. So, he said one afternoon, leaning against my doorway, "Harborwell seems to trust your input. They ask." I replied. I answer. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just make sure we're aligned. Alignment. Another word that sounds collaborative until you hear it often enough. The next escalation was bigger. Miles decided to streamline leadership ahead of close. He drafted a transition plan that quietly removed 3 senior managers, people who'd been with North Shore longer than he had been alive. He framed it as modernization. The plan hit Harborwell's inbox before it hit mine. Evelyn called within minutes. "Did you approve this?" "No," I said. "And it violates the continuity clause." There was a pause. Papers shifting. Someone else breathing on the line. "Can you send us the documentation? I already had it prepared." What Miles never understood was this: by excluding me from meetings, he'd freed me from narrative. I didn't have to persuade. I just had to present reality. By end of day, Harborwell froze all staffing changes pending review. Miles stormed into my office for the first time in weeks. "You're undermining me," he said. I looked up from my screen. "Calm. Steady. I'm doing my job." "Your operations," he snapped. "You don't get to block executive decisions." I didn't correct him, because the contract would do that soon enough. That night, another message arrived from Harborwell. Short, direct, final transition meeting scheduled. Please bring business cards. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, because people don't ask for cards unless they're about to change how the room understands you. And suddenly, I knew exactly how this would end. The morning of the final transition meeting arrived quietly. No alarms, no drama, just a calendar reminder and a building that felt oddly still, like it knew something the people inside it didn't. I arrived early. As usual, old habits don't disappear just because your title is about to change. Miles was already there, new suit, sharper haircut, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're about to win something you don't fully understand. He barely acknowledged me as I took a seat near the far end of the table. My notebook closed, my phone face down. Harborwell's team filed in one by one. Legal first, then finance, then Evelyn, composed as ever, giving me a nod that meant more than any greeting. Finally, Richard Hale, Harborwell's CEO, took the seat at the head of the table. Miles straightened. This was his moment, or so he thought. Richard opened without ceremony. "Let's review transition readiness and leadership alignment." Miles jumped in immediately. He spoke about vision, velocity, cultural reset. He clicked through slides filled with arrows and future state diagrams. Somewhere in the middle, my name appeared once under a section titled Outgoing Operational Support. I didn't react. Then came the staffing slide. Miles cleared his throat. To ensure agility post-close, we'll be making a few leadership adjustments. He glanced at me, briefly, just long enough to make it clear. Richard didn't interrupt. He didn't nod either. He waited. When Miles finished, the room was silent. Richard turned not to Miles, but to Evelyn. Continuity review. She opened her folder. Several of these changes require approval under the continuity framework. Miles frowned. We've discussed this. I'm the acting CEO. Richard looked at him evenly. You're the acting CEO of a company in transition. Then he turned to me. Odessa, he said. Can you clarify whether these changes were approved? Every eye in the room shifted. I could have spoken, explained, cited clauses, walked them through the logic step by step. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket. The card was simple, clean, no flourish, just my name, my role, and Harborwell's logo. I placed it on the table and slid it forward. The sound it made paper against glass was barely audible, but the effect was immediate. Miles laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. That's not funny. Richard picked up the card. He didn't laugh. He read it once, then again. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled not at me, but at the situation. Evelyn exhaled softly, like someone watching a plan finally lock into place. Legal flipped to a page already marked. Miles's laughter died mid-breath. No, he said. This hasn't been. Richard raised a hand. Calm, final. We'll address that in a moment. The room felt heavier now, charged, like gravity had shifted slightly to one side, and for the first time since he'd taken the job, Miles looked uncertain, because authority hadn't just moved. It had done so without asking his permission. If you watch until the end, you will understand what everyone else missed. Richard didn't rush. That was the part Miles hadn't prepared for. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, then nodded to Harborwell's general counsel. She opened the folder in front of her and turned it so the table could see. Page 14, she said evenly. Paragraph E. Miles leaned forward. This is unnecessary, whatever confusion there is. We can clear it up offline. It is being cleared up. Richard replied, right now. The lawyer began to read, not quickly, not dramatically, just clearly. All transition phase staffing and operational decisions shall fall under the final authority of the designated continuity lead, whose approval may not be overridden by interim or acting executives unless ratified by the acquiring board. She paused. Designated continuity lead Odessa Lane. Miles stared at the page as if it might change if he looked long enough. That's not possible, he said. I never agreed to that. Richard folded his hands. You signed the agreement. I didn't read it like that, Miles snapped. Legal said it was standard. It is, the lawyer said calmly. Standard when the buyer identifies operational risk tied to leadership volatility. That landed harder than any accusation. Miles's jaw tightened. So what she outranks me now, Richard answered before anyone else could. For transition operations, yes. The room stayed quiet. No one defended Miles. No one argued. Because contracts don't care about hierarchy. They care about signatures. And just to be clear, Richard continued, any staffing changes proposed without continuity approval are void. He looked at the slide still frozen on the screen, the one listing senior managers as transitional exits. Miles swallowed. Evelyn spoke next. We'll also be reversing the procurement workflow changes and restoring the prior compliance structure, effective immediately. Miles turned to her. You can't just roll things back. I've already approved it, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since placing the card on the table. Miles looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Richard nodded. Thank you. Now, Miles, we need to discuss your role going forward. Miles straightened, grasping at the familiar. Of course. I assume I'll continue leading post-close under Odessa's operational oversight. Richard didn't respond right away. He opened a second folder, thin, precise. Actually, he said, we've decided on a different arrangement. Miles' confidence flickered. You'll be reassigned to a facilities operations role at our regional distribution center. It's a good opportunity to gain hands-on experience. Miles blinked. You're demoting me. We're repositioning you, Richard replied. Same compensation, different scope. The words sounded generous. They weren't night shifts, warehouses, real consequences. Miles' mouth opened, then closed. He glanced around the table, searching for support that wasn't there. Finally, he looked at me. You planned this. I met his eyes. Calm, steady. No. I said, I prepared for it. There's a difference. And that difference had just ended his career trajectory in a single meeting. The meeting ended without ceremony. No applause, no raised voices. Just the quiet sound of chairs moving back and folders closing like a courtroom after a verdict. Harborwell's team filed out first, already discussing timelines and next steps, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Because to them, it hadn't. This was simply risk resolution. Miles stayed seated. Everyone else drifted out, avoiding eye contact, giving him space he hadn't earned but desperately needed. I gathered my notebook and stood, fully expecting to walk past him without another word. Odessa, he said, not sharp, not angry, small. I turned. He was still holding the reassignment letter Richard had slid across the table. He hadn't folded it, just stared at it like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. You knew, he said quietly. All this time, I considered my answer carefully. I knew you didn't understand what you were running, I said, and I knew you thought confidence could replace experience. His jaw tightened. You could have warned me. I did. I replied. You called it resistance. That landed harder than anything said in the meeting. He looked down at the paper again. Kansas City. He muttered. Night operations. They'll teach you more in 6 months than any deck ever could. I said. If you let them. He didn't respond. I walked out. Back at my desk, my old desk. For now, I clipped the temporary Harborwell badge to my jacket. The plastic made a soft click. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation. Emails were already waiting. Legal asking for my availability. Finance requesting approval to restore vendor terms. Operations asking which priorities came first. For the first time in weeks. The noise made sense again. By late afternoon, Harborwell's integration announcement went out. Carefully worded, neutral. No names highlighted, just structure, authority, and continuity. Miles's name appeared once, buried. Transitional. I didn't celebrate. I made lists. Systems to restore. People to reassure. Trust to rebuild internally and externally. Because power is fleeting, responsibility isn't. That evening, my phone buzzed while I was packing up. A message from an unknown number. This is Miles. I start in Kansas City next week. I didn't understand what you were trying to do. I think I do now. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed back. Listen more than you talk. Learn the work. That's where credibility comes from. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Thank you. That was it. I turned off my phone and left the building as the lights dimmed behind me. Tomorrow would be long, hard, necessary, and for the first time in months. I felt something close to calm, because the company wasn't being steered by noise anymore. It was being guided by someone who knew how the machine actually worked. The real work began the next morning. No announcements, no town hall. Just a series of quiet emails restoring access, reinstating workflows, and reopening channels that had been optimized into paralysis. I didn't change titles. I didn't reshuffle desks. I fixed systems, first priority vendors. I called the 3 suppliers who'd been put on hold and owned the disruption without assigning blame. I reinstated the redundancy Miles had cut and extended payment windows as a show of good faith. 2 thanked me for calling personally. One asked if we were back to being serious. I told them yes and meant it. Second priority, compliance. We rolled back the experimental tooling and restored the audited framework. Legal regained visibility. Reports validated cleanly. The regulator's inquiry was answered with documentation instead of apologies. By noon, the risk dashboard went from amber to green. Third priority, people. I met with the managers Miles had tried to exit. No speeches, no promises, just clarity. Their roles were secure, their authority restored. One of them, a warehouse director, who hadn't taken a vacation in 5 years, sat back and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the acquisition was announced. By midweek, Harborwell's integration team stopped checking in and started planning forward. Timelines stabilized, dependencies aligned. The machine hummed again, not fast, not flashy, but steady. That's when the whispers started. Not about Miles, about me. Questions. Careful and curious. Is she staying? Who does she report to now? Is this permanent? I didn't answer them, because permanence is decided by outcomes, not rumors. On Thursday afternoon, Evelyn asked me to join a call with Harborwell's board liaison. No agenda, just context. I laid out the recovery steps, the remaining risks, and the timeline to full stabilization. I didn't ask for anything. At the end, the liaison said, "You run operations like an engineer. I am one." I replied. There was a pause. Then, good, that night. I walked through the warehouse floor for the first time in months. Forklifts moved with purpose, screens updated in real time. A supervisor waved and said, "Feels normal again? Normal?" The highest compliment. Another message came in late. This time from Evelyn. "Board's pleased. Let's talk next steps tomorrow." I didn't celebrate. I went home and slept. The following week, Harborwell extended my role quietly. Same scope, more runway. Enough time to finish the bridge I'd been holding together since the acquisition began. Miles sent one last message from Kansas City. First week was rough. Learned more than I expected. I typed back a single line. That's how it starts. Because careers don't end with laughter. They end with lessons whether you're ready for them or not. And as North Shore settled into its new structure, one thing became clear to everyone: watching stability wasn't accidental. It was designed. By the second month, the chaos felt distant, not erased, just contained, like a storm that had passed without leaving structural damage. Harborwell's name was on the building now, but North Shore's spine was still intact. That mattered more than branding. Metrics told the story before anyone spoke it out loud. On-time deliveries climbed back above baseline. Vendor disputes dropped to zero. Compliance audits closed without follow-ups. Quiet wins. The kind that never make slides, but decide whether companies survive. Harborwell noticed. So did people who had never bothered to learn my name before. Executives I'd only seen in kickoff calls started asking for my perspective. Not in meetings one-on-one. Short conversations. Direct questions. What breaks if we scale this faster? Where are the hidden costs? Who actually understands this system? I answered honestly. Sometimes the answer was me. Sometimes it wasn't. Either way, the truth held. One afternoon, Richard asked me to walk him through the operations floor. No entourage, no cameras, just questions and silence. He listened more than he spoke. At the end, he said, "You know what most leaders miss, what I asked. They think control is loud," he said, "but the people who really run things rarely need to announce it." I nodded. That lesson had come at a cost. A week later, Evelyn called me into her office. No files this time. No draft documents. Just a single letter on Harborwell stationery. "We'd like to make your role permanent," she said. "Full authority, full scope." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to be sure. "What happens when things are calm?" I asked. "When there's no crisis to justify continuity." She smiled. "That's when we need you most." The offer was fair, more than fair. Equity, autonomy, time. I accepted. That evening, I walked past the conference room where Miles had laughed. The glass table was gone, replaced with something simpler, functional, like the rest of the company had learned its lesson. My phone buzzed once more. A final message from Miles. I think I finally understand what leadership actually is. I didn't reply. Some realizations don't need validation. As I left the building, the lights shut off floor by floor behind me, not dramatically, methodically. That's how systems rest when they're finally in capable hands. Not with applause. With trust. 6 months later. No one talked about the meeting anymore. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it no longer mattered. North Shore didn't survive the acquisition by luck or clever maneuvering. It survived because the right systems were in place, and the right people were trusted to run them. That's the part most stories leave out. The company didn't suddenly become brilliant. It became boring again in the best possible way. Processes worked. Decisions had owners. Problems surfaced early and were solved without theater. The machine did what it was designed to do, and I let it. I stopped being everywhere. I delegated. I documented. I built redundancy into myself because leadership isn't about being irreplaceable. It's about making sure the work survives you, one afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports. I noticed something small but telling. A margin improvement in a region that had struggled for years. No fanfare, no announcement, just a quiet correction made by a manager who finally had the authority to act. That's when I knew it was done. Not the job, but the chapter. Miles never came back. I heard, indirectly, that he stayed in Kansas City longer than expected. Learned the floor, learned names, learned consequences. Eventually moved on to another company. Another title. Another chance to apply what pain had taught him. I hope he did, because what ended that day in the conference room wasn't just his position. It was a version of leadership that mistakes volume for value. As for the business card, the one that made him laugh, I still carry it. Not because it represents victory, but because it reminds me how fragile authority really is when it isn't earned. People ask me sometimes how it felt to watch his career unravel in real time. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like gravity. You ignore structure long enough, and eventually it corrects you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't need to. I read the system. I respected it. And when the moment came, I let it speak for me. That's the part no one claps for, but it's the part that lasts. So if there's one thing I've learned after 12 years of building, months of silence, and one card slid across a table, it's this: you don't win by being louder than everyone else. You win by being the one who understands what actually keeps the lights on. And when the noise finally fades, that's when real careers begin. I want to pause for a moment, not to explain, but to listen. Stories like this aren't really about contracts or titles. They're about what happens when quiet competence meets unchecked ego. How did this one make you feel? Was there a moment or detail that stayed with you longer than the rest? Tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. If this story resonated, leave a comment, tap like, share it with someone who needs it, and consider subscribing. We're building something meaningful here. Together. Together. Together.